At 0155 hours local time, the causeway at Chongar stopped being a road and started being a fire. A tanker near the rear third of the column ruptured first, and the flame it produced did not politely stay in one lane. It found the trailer behind it, then the ammunition truck behind that, and kept moving down the line the way a fuse moves down a line, except this fuse was 50 vehicles long, and none of them had anywhere to go. The drones that lit it had flown almost 70 miles to get there, most of it low over open steppe, and the last few miles over water so shallow it barely counted as water at all. Waiting for them on the bridge deck were somewhere close to 40 fuel trucks and ammunition carriers, stacked bumper to bumper across a crossing that was never built to hold that much weight, that much fuel, or that much attention at once. Within 4 minutes, the glow over the water was visible from a village nearly 12 miles away, and by the time anyone with the authority to do something about it understood what was happening, there was no longer anything left to do. None of that was the strange part of the night. The strange part was that this convoy had not been ambushed on the move, the way most convoys are. It had been ambushed while standing still. On a bridge it had already crossed 100 times without incident, waiting patiently in a line it had no reason to expect would ever be a problem. Drivers who survived would later describe the wait itself as unremarkable, the same slow shuffle forward, a few yards at a time, that every crossing of this bridge had involved for weeks. Nothing in the rhythm of that night distinguishing it from any of the nights that came before it, right up until the rhythm stopped mattering at all. To understand why that line existed at all, you have to look at the map the way a Russian logistics officer has been forced to look at it for the past several months. Crimea connects to the mainland through a small handful of fixed points, a rail bridge, a couple of road bridges, and a scattering of causeways crossing the shallow lagoons of the Sivash. That is not a design choice, it is geography. There is no scenic alternate route through a sea. By the time of this strike, 2 of those crossings had already been struck badly enough that Ukrainian officials described them as unsafe for heavy traffic, and a third had taken damage serious enough to force convoys onto reduced load limits, crawling across at a fraction of their normal speed just to avoid finishing the job Ukraine had already started. That left Chongar carrying almost everything: fuel, shells, spare parts, replacement crews, all of it funneled through one crossing because the other doors had already been closed. 4 lanes narrowing into one gate does not make the traffic disappear. It makes the traffic stand still, and it makes it stand still in a single, countable line. Ukraine did not do this by accident, and it did not do it in one night. The campaign against Crimea's bridges had been running for weeks. Each strike aimed less at destroying the enemy directly and more at removing an option. Hit one crossing and the traffic reroutes. Hit a second and the reroute gets narrower. The first bridge to go had been struck twice inside the same week, and by the time engineers finished their initial assessment, the span could still technically bear weight, but only at speeds so reduced that a single truck crossing it took nearly 10 minutes, a delay that on its own was enough to push most convoy commanders toward the next available option instead. The second crossing lasted only slightly longer. Its support piers cracked badly enough after a follow-up strike that Russian traffic engineers posted a hard weight limit that no fuel tanker could realistically meet while fully loaded. By the time Chongar was the only crossing still absorbing the full weight of Russian logistics into the peninsula, Ukrainian planners already understood something the Russian side had not yet worked out for itself: that the bridge itself was no longer the most interesting target on the board. What was queued up on top of it was. That is where the waiting comes in. And the waiting is the part of this story that gets skipped over the most, because it does not look like anything happening. A convoy in motion is a moving problem. You have to find it, predict where it will be, and get a strike asset into position early enough to meet it there. And every minute spent deciding where to aim is a minute the convoy has already spent driving somewhere else. A convoy stopped at a choke point is a different kind of problem entirely, because it solves itself. The lead vehicle is stopped because the vehicle ahead of it is stopped. Nothing about that changes until the bottleneck widens. And Ukraine had already made sure the bottleneck was not going to widen, because there was nowhere left for it to widen into. So instead of chasing a moving convoy across open ground, the way earlier strikes in this war often did, Ukrainian reconnaissance simply watched the queue build, night after night, and waited for it to reach the size worth spending a strike package on. That patience mattered more than anything else in this story, because everything Russia had positioned to defend this crossing had been built to answer a fast-moving problem, not a standing one. For nearly 9 nights before the strike, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones simply logged the queue length at Chongar without ever firing a single warhead, building a pattern of how many vehicles typically gathered, how long they typically sat before crossing, and which nights the line grew longest. Several of those nights, the column was barely a dozen vehicles deep, not worth the risk of exposing a strike package to intercept for such a modest return. It was only when signals intelligence indicated a large fuel and ammunition shipment had departed a rear depot bound for the front, the kind of concentrated load that would force an unusually long wait at the bottleneck, that Ukrainian planners finally set the operation in motion. A Pantsir S-1 battery sat on high ground just west of the approach road, exactly the kind of self-contained system Russia parks over things it cannot afford to lose. Its own search radar, its own tracking radar, missiles, and a rapid-fire cannon. No outside network required. Reaction times measured in single digits from detection to launch. Against a drone diving on a fixed-point target, a hangar, a radar site, a command post, that reaction window is more than enough. But the thing sitting in front of this Pantsir crew that night was not a point. It was a line nearly a mile long, strung out across a causeway with almost no cover on either side. Ask a goalkeeper trained his whole career to read a penalty kick, to instead defend a ball rolling somewhere behind him along the ground, and every reflex he has built still fires, just not at anything useful. Detection, classification, slew, commit, even executed quickly, that sequence eats several real seconds, and several seconds at low-level cruise speed covers thousands of feet of ground. Against a single building, those thousands of feet still land you inside the defended radius. Against a target the length of a bridge and its approach road, those same thousands of feet can carry a drone straight past the section the Pantsir was actually covering. The crew inside that vehicle were not incompetent, and they were not asleep at their console. They were simply solving the wrong shape of problem, trained and equipped to protect a point on a map, when the thing that needed protecting that night was a line stretching almost a mile in both directions, most of which sat well outside any single engagement envelope their system could realistically cover from one fixed position. The other defensive layer that night was invisible, and in some ways more important than the Pantsir. Russian forces have made a habit of parking dedicated jamming systems near fixed crossings, vehicles built specifically to smother the satellite navigation links and control signals that most cheap FPV drones depend on to function. Inside that jamming envelope, a first-person view quadcopter flown live by an operator watching a video feed becomes close to useless, cut off from its pilot and reduced to a falling object with no one steering it down. But jamming only works against something that is still listening for instructions, and the aircraft flying toward Chongar that night were not waiting on anyone. Long-range strike drones loaded with pre-programmed coordinates and flying a route decided hours earlier were not asking a question the jammer could interrupt. They had already been told where to go before they ever crossed into range of the jamming, and shouting louder at a signal that no longer needs to hear you changes nothing about where it lands. This mismatch is not a Russian mistake so much as a Russian bet, and most of the time it is the correct one. Every air defense asset has to be positioned against the threat that shows up most often, and along the approaches to Crimea, the threat that shows up most often really is small, cheap, and radio-controlled. Coverage built around that threat works, most nights, against most attacks. The problem is the corridor also has to survive the threat that shows up rarely, the pre-programmed long-range strike package that does not care what frequency is being jammed because it never needed to hear anything in the first place. Nobody optimizes for the rare threat until after it has already arrived, and on this particular night, it had. There is also a simpler, more human reason this bet keeps being made. A jamming vehicle and its crew have a finite amount of attention and a finite amount of power to push into the spectrum at any given moment. And every watt spent smothering a threat that never actually needed the link in the first place is a watt not spent doing anything else useful that night. The crews manning that equipment along the Chongar approach had almost certainly spent months successfully grounding cheap FPVs launched by exhausted operators flying line of sight from a few miles away. Success like that breeds confidence, and confidence, applied against the wrong category of threat, becomes exactly the kind of blind spot a patient enemy learns to route an entire strike package straight through. The mission, as it had likely been planned days in advance, was a bridge mission. Weaken the structure enough to force another routing crisis and let the logistics problem compound on its own over the following weeks. But a crossing that has become the last functioning crossing does not sit empty waiting for a strike window that is convenient. When the drones finally crossed the final stretch of open water and came within visual range of the causeway, the deck was not clear. It was full, nose to tail, engines idling, exactly the traffic jam 3 earlier strikes had spent weeks quietly engineering. The target had upgraded itself without anyone needing to change the plan. What happened in the seconds after the first detonation is not something anyone documented in real time, because nobody inside that column was thinking in terms of documentation. From the driver's seat of a fuel truck near the middle of the line, this was simply a slow, familiar night on a road they had crossed dozens of times before, right up until it was not. Fuel does not explode the way it does on screen. It vents first, throwing vapor into the air before that vapor finds a spark, and the whole cloud lights at once in a flash faster than anything on that bridge could react to. The truck that ruptured first was gone within the first second. The trucks on either side of it were not gone, and that was worse, because now they were heat sources sitting directly against the next vehicle in line, and the next one, and the one after that. That is how a column like this dies, not all at once, but in order, the way dominoes fall rather than the way a single blast lands. Fuel trucks went first, then more fuel, then something with a harder edge to its sound. Ammunition does not require a direct hit to cook off. It only needs time and heat, and a burning vehicle parked beside it supplies both in abundance. The first true cook-off changed the character of the noise on that bridge entirely. A sharper, flatter crack that had nothing in common with the low roar of burning diesel, and then another crack, and then a string of them overlapping until it was impossible to separate one detonation from the next. Rounds cooked off inside covered truck beds. Beds came apart under the pressure. Fragments crossed the road and punched holes into vehicles that had not yet caught fire, and holes in a fuel tank are simply an invitation for more fuel to spill into an already burning environment. Some of those fragments carried far enough to strike vehicles near the rear of the column that had, until that moment, believed themselves safely outside the blast radius entirely. A reminder that on a target this compressed, there is effectively no such thing as a safe distance. Drivers who could still move ran, though there was almost nowhere on a narrow causeway to run to. There was not simply more causeway. Underneath all of it, the bridge itself was absorbing damage it had never been engineered to survive. A structure like this can tolerate enormous static weight almost indefinitely. What it cannot tolerate is sustained heat working against structural steel while that steel is still under load, combined with repeated blast pressure hammering at every joint and connection point along the span. Somewhere in the middle of that chain reaction, the deck stopped functioning as a road and became something closer to a collection of damaged sections that used to be a road, sagging visibly along its central span, cracked clean through the surface in places, with still burning vehicles sitting on the portions that had not yet been consumed. The whole event, from first detonation to the point where nothing more useful was going to happen, took a little under 3 minutes. By the end of it, the column could not advance because the roadway ahead of the fire had buckled beyond use. It could not reverse because the vehicles behind it were now blocked by burning wreckage of their own, and it could not disperse in any direction because a causeway surrounded on both sides by shallow lagoon offers exactly nowhere to disperse to. Everything Russia had been forced to funnel through this one remaining crossing was now sitting on top of it, burning, and none of it was reaching the units waiting for it at the front. The numbers that came out of the wreckage are unusually clean for a strike of this kind, which is itself telling. Ukrainian sources reported close to 40 vehicles destroyed or disabled at the crossing, the bulk of them fuel tankers and ammunition trucks staged for a specific push further along the front line. Not a routine trickle of supply traffic, but a deliberately assembled shipment meant to sustain an entire formation through an upcoming operation. None of it arrived where it was supposed to. And the bridge itself came out of that night in a condition Ukrainian officials would later describe in blunt, almost clinical terms, damaged badly enough that it did not require a second strike to finish the job. That sentence deserves to be sat with for a moment. Success here was not measured by whether the structure collapsed outright. It was measured by the fact that nobody on the other side was going to bother trying to use it again anytime soon. Strategically, this was never a single night's achievement standing on its own. It was the final step in a sequence that had already removed one crossing, then narrowed a second to a fraction of its former capacity, then forced traffic to compress onto whatever was left standing, until the last working option was carrying a load it was never designed to carry by itself. That is what separates this kind of campaign from the strikes that tend to get more attention in the news cycle. Nobody involved in planning this was trying to seize Crimea. They were trying to make holding Crimea expensive, slow, and increasingly unpredictable to supply. A peninsula does not need to be captured to stop functioning as a reliable military rear area. It only needs to become somewhere that moving fuel and ammunition in and out becomes a genuine gamble rather than a routine task. There is a compounding effect sitting underneath all of this that matters more than the burned-out trucks themselves. Military logistics depends far more on predictability than on raw capacity. A planner can work around a slow route as long as that route is slow in a way he can schedule around in advance. What a planner cannot easily work around is a route that might be open next week and might not be, because once a crossing becomes a genuine question mark, every depot and staging area upstream of it starts holding on to stock it would much rather already be moving forward. And stock that is being held back out of caution is stock sitting still in one place, concentrated, predictable, and eventually vulnerable in exactly the way this convoy turned out to be. That is precisely how the next overloaded column ends up looking almost identical to the last one. Multiply that hesitation across every depot commander now watching the news of Chongar's condition, and the effect stops being about one bridge entirely. It becomes a tax applied to every single shipment attempting to reach the peninsula, whether that shipment ever comes anywhere near this particular crossing or not, simply because nobody planning a route through Crimea can any longer assume the road they used last week will still be usable this week. It is worth being honest about what a strike like this does not accomplish, too. The peninsula is not sealed off. Ferries exist and can be surged onto a route in days. Pontoon crossings can be laid across the Sivash lagoons, and Russian engineers have proven capable of doing exactly that before when circumstances demanded it. Damaged rail and road infrastructure can eventually be repaired, given enough time, enough concrete, and enough security to protect the repair crews while they work. What genuinely changes is the cost attached to every single ton that has to move across that water from now on. More handling, more delay, more choke points where a shipment has to sit exposed while someone works out how to get it across. In a war where the front line has been moving in increments measured in yards rather than miles, and where ammunition availability decides more of what happens on any given day than almost anything else, that added cost is not a side effect. It is the entire point of the campaign. Ukraine did not need to destroy every bridge connecting Crimea to the mainland in a single sweeping operation. It needed to close enough of them, in the right order, that the survivors would eventually do the rest of the work by simply attracting everything Russia had no choice but to send through them. That is the quiet arithmetic sitting underneath every one of these strikes, an arithmetic that has nothing to do with how spectacular any single explosion looks on video, and everything to do with how few working options an enemy has left the next time a shipment absolutely has to move. If you found this breakdown useful,